So what I'm going to try to do is paint this pumpkin, half of it with watercolor. I have my watercolors here. This is my Daniel Smith Essentials set that I talked about on Watercolor Week. And then I have my whole bean gouache here. And I'm going to do it with watercolor on one side, and then I'm going to do it with the gouache on the other side. And I may not have that exactly half. Let me see if I can put this more in the middle of my pumpkin. It'll be close enough. So I'm just going to talk you through how I'm going to do it with the watercolor first, and then we are going to work on doing it with gouache, and I'm going to go over the techniques of gouache. So the first thing I would do if I was doing this in watercolor is I would mix up a nice light yellow. And I would wet the whole thing, except for where I wanted some highlights maybe. And I'm doing wet on dry. The paper is dry, and I am just going straight onto that dry paper with my paint, my pigment. Now while it's still wet, I need to get a paper towel, sorry. While it's still wet, I'm going to mix up a darker orange. Now I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do this super realistically because we don't have time for all that. I'm just trying to show you kind of the difference. See how translucent that is? I'm going to lift a little bit here and there. Then I'm going to mix up a little bit of a darker orange. And right here where there's sort of little sections, I am going to do my wet and wet, or charging, or whatever you want to call it, and just put that where those little sections are. I'm going to lift a little bit of it with my brush, sort of blend it out a little. And where I want it to be really dark, I'm going to add a little bit more pigment where I really want that shadowy look, that darker look. I'm going to drop it in there. So this is wet on wet. You can also call it charging if you want. And I'm just going to use basic colors. I'm not going to add any purples or anything in there, just some basic colors. Now I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to do a few more techniques in watercolor, and then we're going to start on the gouache side. Alright, I've dried that, but then I noticed that I didn't get this little spot here or right there. So I'm just going to put in some little darker orange. Now for this orange, I want to do some shadows, so I'm going to come in here with this red and mix it with my orange to get a deeper shadowier color. So now we are glazing or layering, however you want to call it. So it's completely dry. We're putting another color onto completely dry watercolor, and then I am going to soften the edges with a damp brush so that we'll get a nice smooth transition. And get rid of those hard edges. So these are just basic techniques. We're not going, like I said, I'm not going to do a whole lot of super realistic details. I'm just trying to show you some of the techniques in watercolor, and we're going to use some of these same techniques. We're softening again, softening. We're going to use some of these same techniques with the gouache. So now we've got that pretty softened up. There's a hard line right here, so I'm just going to take my damp brush and just sort of lift that, get rid of that hard edge. Now I'm going to do some dry brushing for that. First I'm going to do a nice pale, sort of a brownish green. Needs more yellow. There we go. I'm going to do a nice pale yellow-green wash on this stem. Then I'm going to let it dry. And I'll be back to show you a few more techniques in watercolor, and then we're going to do this side in gouache. So now that little part of the stem is dry. I have a completely dry brush. There's no water on this brush. It's dry. I've mixed up a darker green so that it'll show up, because I'm going to show you how to dry brush. That's my other technique I'm going to show you. And this is still with my watercolor techniques, but they also apply to gouache as well. So I'm going to pick up some pigment. Then just to make sure it's dry, I'm going to tap off the excess water onto a paper towel. And you can't. It's so small you can barely see how it's dragging across and just leaving a little bit of texture. But that's exactly what we want. We just want a little bit of texture there. We could even do some like foreshadow. See the breaks? You can see the white coming through. Just make this be something on the ground. I'm just wanting to show you this in a bigger area so that you can see what the dry brush looks like. It's just going right along the top of those bumps on the watercolor paper, just letting a little bit of white shine through. Alright, now we are going to do, let's dry this off, and then we're going to do this other half in gouache. I'm going to put away my watercolor. I'm going to put it over here to the side and get my little raggedy meat tray and start mixing up some oranges. Put my purple back in here. Let's see, what color? I'm going to go with this flame red, just a little bit, because we don't need a lot for this project. A little bit of the flame red, a little bit of this permanent yellow deep. It's here. I'm going to go with a little bit of the lemon yellow. Just put a little bit there. A little bit of the other red. Alright, some of the blue. Maybe not some of the blue, I can't get it open. Here we go. Just a little bit of blue, if we need it. And some white. Might need more white. One tip I want to give you is if you want to use gouache, get a big tube of white. That will serve you a lot better because you're going to use a lot of white in the mixing. So let me let's mix us a nice orange here. And we're going to start off doing the watercolor technique of going straight on to dry paper. It doesn't flow across the paper the same way that it does with watercolor. So the gouache, but we have got it thinned enough so that it does have some of the consistency of watercolor, but it is not flowing as easy. So let's try wet on wet. That was wet on dry. Let's try wet on wet. So I'm going to wet this next section. And now it acts much more like watercolor. Now I'm going to go thicker on this one, and what I'm going to do is add a little bit of white to my orange color. So we're not using it like watercolor there, we're just using it like thick opaque gouache. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do that to all of them. I think that'll serve you better, but you did see that you can use it wet on wet and wet on dry, very similar to watercolor, but now I'm going to go back and do it with traditional, just cover this up with a thick opaque layer. Then we can do some blending while it's still wet. You want to take your darker color in there while it's wet and just sort of blend it out with your brush. And I'm just using my watercolor brush for this, to do this. I'm going to get a little bit of this darker red here for the shadow. And one good thing about gouache is you can paint over it, so if you get mistakes, you can just paint over them. Now I'm going to get a little bit of water and just sort of blend this together right here and on these edges, because I don't want it to be such a hard transition. Now I'm going to do some lifting just like I did with the watercolor. I'll put a little bit of a darker color here. Now we're going to let that dry, and I'm going to do another layer on it. So now to get some white highlights, I'm going to dip into my white paint. I'm just going to put those highlights right where I want them while it onto this dried pumpkin. Just using white. And it's almost a dry brush technique. I don't have a lot of water in there. And you can put the white thicker where you want it to be brighter, because it does sort of melt into the previous layer a little bit. So you're going to have to put a few more layers on that to get it as white as you want it. Now I'm going to use a little bit of this blue, just a tiny bit, and I'm going to water it down and then glaze over some of these areas at the bottom to make a shadow. And then I'm going to blend it out with a damp brush. Just soften those edges. Now I'm going to work on the stem. that in there. Now you could do it watered down if you want, like we did with the watercolor, but I'm going to go with the opaque since that seems to be where we are going. While that is wet, I'm going to pick up just a little teeny bit of this green right here and just do a few lines in there. Also put a few here. You can also do that dry brush. Brush it dry enough. There, that's better. It's not as dry as that watercolor, but it's still pretty good. And the colors aren't exactly the same. But I want you to be able to see the difference between the watercolor side and the gouache side. I'm putting a little yellow in those highlights. That just sort of warms it up some. And then I'm going to take some of that yellow and just do some brighter lines. Now here is doing the opaque details. You see this lighter color is going perfectly over this darker color and just really standing out from it. You cannot do that with watercolor. Now you can kind of scumble if you want to add some texture. Scumbling is just sort of like bouncing your brush up and down. Let's get some darker orange. Just sort of bouncing your brush and doing sort of scumbling marks on it. That'll give the pumpkin some texture if you want it. I know I'm messing this pumpkin up, but I'm trying to show you some techniques. So that's some scumbling that you can do. You can splatter it if you want. I'm not going to splatter mine, but splattering is just like with watercolor. You'll get a really wet brush. Here, I'll show you. I hate splattering. You get you a really wet brush and then you can just splatter it right across your paper. That don't look too bad. That don't look too bad at all. So we've covered all of the major ones. Now I'm going to just do the individual gouache techniques on a separate sheet of paper. And we'll go over each one and some of the things that you could use it for. There you go. I don't know if you can see the difference. I can see the difference up close, but there you go. One side is watercolor, one side is gouache, and some of the techniques I want to show you with gouache. So next up, I'm going to show you the individual techniques that you can use with gouache. And we're going to label them out so that you won't be confused.